Hello again. This time, we have a new topic to discuss. Although it is already on this channel, through an essay I wrote, I decided to go more in depth to the idea of how to pay off our national debt and simultaneously work to abolish taxation eventually. So, figured I'd borrow a person's gloves for this to be a bit more significant, and we have successfully MacGyvered, to some extent, a stationary camera so I can use both hands for this. So, let's take a look at our plan. So, starting off, let's look at the numbers. Now, the debt, it may be difficult to see, but currently the national debt is about 37 trillion. This is according to the national debt clock, so how accurate that is, who knows. Second up, it's the expenses. So I went to the Congressional Budget Office and checked operating expenses for the government and its revenues in 2024. The expenses as given were 6.8 trillion in expenses and 4.9 trillion in revenues. Now, I later decided to take a look at some other things. You can see some math right there. And what I found was that Social Security, according to the same metrics, cost $1.5 trillion that year. There was $860 billion spent on Medicare and $620 billion spent on Medicaid. So I converted it over to the trillions, so that's 0.86 trillion and 0.62 trillion. Now, if we cut these three, that would leave us with a budget of 3.82 trillion. Very, very useful for the next part of the plan. As for revenues, that was 4.9 trillion, and that revenue to GDP ratio was about 17.06%. So, assuming a GDP of 28.83 trillion, that would be the revenue to GDP ratio. The OECD average is in the 30% range, so if we raised revenues to that through increased taxes, assuming no drop-off due to the Laffer curve, we see $9.77 trillion. So combine the two together, that would be, excuse me for a second, that would be this math right here. We would get a surplus of almost 6 trillion. Now, assuming just that, no other factors, and doing the math just like that, you would get 37 trillion divided by 5.95 trillion to find out how many years it takes to pay it off. That would be 6.2 years. In just over 6 years, we could completely pay off the debt. Now, I decided to go in depth on this and actually calculate it out year over year so that we could see how it's going. So in 2024, the interest on the debt was 881 billion. So if we take our adjusted budget and subtract the debt from it, that's 2.939 trillion. Now, if we look here on the graph, we can see, assuming this was implemented right now, and we watched it fall year over year, we would go 37 trillion to 31 trillion the next year, then 25, then 19, 13, 6, 110 billion, and eventually, in just 7 years, we'd have a surplus of 6.72 trillion. Now, what are we going to do with the surplus? What we're going to do is invest into the S&P High Dividend Index. This index fund will be put into a permanent fund. What this means is the U.S. government cannot take money out other than dividends. So anything that comes out of it, the U.S. government will receive as payment, which will be used to replace the taxes, but they can't pull anything out when it's not needed. This is to ensure that the government doesn't just decide to pull things out and force us to pay taxes again. Now, here's where the important numbers come in. So, 10% is the estimate based on my research of how much the yearly dividends will be. So, if this is our budget, no more cuts. I would expect actually less in terms of budget after what we've done, especially if we manage to successfully modernize the military and do a few other cuts I would prefer. We would need $29.39 trillion. Now, in order, if this is our annual dividends, for us to run completely off of them, it would take just over 4 years to gather the adequate number of funds in order to do this. Now, these numbers over here, I'd say even less than 4 years. In fact, if we cut taxes equivalent to all the generated income from the dividends, this would likely increase, so you'd need less here, while simultaneously our GDP would go up, so our tax revenue would increase. Thus, the result would be, over time, this could easily speed up, and we may well see it done in, I'd say 9 years. We could realistically have this done. Difficult, yes, but it is entirely possible within 9 years to completely pay off the debt. Now, we'd likely need to add a year or two of debt to pay off just to compensate people for the loss of these social services up here. But once we do that, let's say that it goes through. Here's what you could theoretically do with all of that. You could establish Roth IRAs for every senior. Any person who puts in would have a better form of Social Security in the form of Roth IRAs. This could be our Social Security afterwards. Or, theoretically, we could instead use this to increase spending on infrastructure. Maybe, if we wanted to, we could use the surplus to invest in a universal basic income. Or, and this is just my personal preference, we could pay off the debts of others. Now, one might ask, why would we do this? Why would we pay off the debts of other countries or other places? The reason why you do this is because it builds our reputation, credit, and influence. If everyone is having their debts paid off by the U.S., let's say we walk over to a developing nation and say, hey, we'll pay off your debt. In exchange, we'd like you to lower your tariffs, drop your VAT, and rearrange your budget in a way that's favorable to the U.S. and its interests. That would be a very easy way to boost U.S. influence without a trade war and increase our trade presence in the area. Simultaneously, because we're getting rid of the debt and taxes, it stabilizes our budget, and simultaneously, we also get more people to invest in us. So we would have the dual benefits of more investment and less risk. We would basically be winning in every front. There would be no need for a trade war because we'd already control the budget of several countries. Furthermore, we could invest locally. So, what if we instead decided to pay off local debts? What I mean by this is the states. If we paid off California's debts, Alaska's, Texas, all of those, we pay them off, and we establish the same in the states. So, we would have each state with their own little permanent fund, whose dividends pay for their government, and therefore they abolish their taxes. Well, what do you think would happen then for business investments? Businesses would come to the U.S. And more than that, our states would prosper. Their people would have offers of new jobs. and higher wages, because if everyone's coming over here, there's only so many people over here, and so they'd have to raise wages to be competitive. And it'd be a whole lot better investment than going to some third world country with a less educated workforce, because, let's face it, we got a decently educated workforce here. And so we would, through this method, be able to encourage economic growth in the U.S., as well as boost the ability of our states to prosper. And once the states are paid off, we could go even lower. Do it for localities, pay off the cities, pay off the counties, and effectively completely abolish taxes throughout the entire United States. You could theoretically drive, if this goes through, from San Francisco all the way over to Boston without ever having to pay sales tax, without ever having to pay tax on your income or on your property. Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be amazing to not have to deal with that? Now, excise taxes could still be raised for things like drugs, alcohol, tobacco, trying to minimize them because they're bad things to do. And thus taxing them reduces consumption because supply and demand. That could still be done. But abolishing taxes for everything else, for consumption, of non-sinful goods, so we're keeping excise taxes theoretically, but abolishing most consumption-based taxes, income tax, dividends taxes, property taxes, all of them gone. You would allow our people to have far more money. Simultaneously, you would allow a lot of investment because we'd basically be a tax haven the size of a continent. And, here's the big one, you would get everyone to want to invest in us. No one would be looking to the third world. There would be no trade deficit anymore, assuming we fix our regulatory sector, because why would you look to somewhere else when you could look to the U.S.? Why pay 30% on all the wages of all the people you have to pay when you could instead go to the U.S., pay none of that, and still make a profit because you can sell it locally? You don't have to spend much on transport because we got a big consumer market, so you can just transport in the U.S. for the most part. Wouldn't have to pay much in terms of taxes because, there are no taxes. And you also wouldn't have to pay much in terms of regulation because we are one of the, let's face it, least regulated Western countries, which is actually a good thing. If any tanky disagrees, they can go shove it. But with all these factors, the U.S. would be in a prime situation to leverage that position. In just 3 terms, you could not only pay off our debts, completely get rid of them, but also make sure the U.S. is firmly at the center of the globe in its politics. Now, some of this could absolutely be turned over for other countries. For example, France, South Korea. I don't think Japan's in much of a position to do anything anymore, but South Sudan and other countries could implement most of these policies and probably still end up in a similar position. Other than the fact that they don't have the size and the power that the U.S. does already. They inherently start off with a disadvantage because they don't have our economic power and our position in the globe. For the U.S., if we truly tried this, we could be not just the most powerful country in the world, which we already are, but the country able to essentially dictate terms to every single country across the globe. Now, if you're talking America first, that sounds like an America first policy. There's only one problem with this plan, and that's the recession that's likely to come on from these measures. For those who don't know, these measures are called austerity measures. When you reduce spending and increase taxation, you are engaging in austerity. It has its issues. Notably, due to the contraction in the money supply, less spending occurs, and so people generally don't spend. What this means is you get a recession because GDP is calculated through spending. It is consumer spending plus investments plus government spending plus exports minus imports, and that is GDP. So, again, assuming that we're doing it based off just debt to GDP, what's going to end up happening is these guys are less likely to spend, this is being reduced, and people will probably be a bit worried initially, so this is going to go down a bit. And so this would likely go down in the interim period. During the austerity measures, we're likely going to see a small recession. However, here's why I advocate for this. Sure, we'll suffer for a bit. So let's say, hypothetically, this is the economy right now. What's likely to happen is we're going to stall for a bit, and then we're going to rise rapidly once we finally get it done. I'd say it'd be closer to this, but regardless. So that is if we do it. What if we stay the course, keep the debt? What's likely going to happen is, because of how debt works, we're going to see it go up a bit, but it'll slow down. Eventually, it'll plateau, and then it'll collapse. Because the United States cannot sustain debt for too long. Because debt, by its very nature, increases inflation, decreases trust, and puts you at the mercy of foreign powers, meaning this is likely to go up, which reduces GDP. Simultaneously, this is likely to go down, and you are less likely to have influence because you are dependent on outsiders. It doesn't matter how much money you have if you can't use it effectively. So, here's what I see as our options. We keep going as it is. Debt keeps rising, we eventually hit a plateau and we suffer. Or, for less than a decade, if we assume people live to 60, which in the US they are likely to live longer, assuming 60 is the age at which people will on average die, that's less than a sixth of your life. That's not much in terms of time for this. In the time between middle school and the start of college, we could have made this so much easier for everyone, and you'll be able to enter the workforce much better off than you were otherwise. If you're just getting out of college, by the time you're looking to buy a house or settle down, you're going to be not paying taxes and facing a massive economic boom. Well, what if you already bought a house? By that time, if we start there, by the end, you won't have to pay taxes on your house, so you'll be able to give it to your children. Parents who are looking at their kids growing up, think about it. Would you rather have your kids enter into this economy or this economy? I think it's fairly obvious which. So, it's your choice. Would you prefer to side with me and stall for a bit, but grow rapidly as interest compounds, or let it all collapse? I know where I stand. So, that begs the question, what do you?